Evening. Seems to be about that time, so we'll begin this evening's services. Thank you, everybody, and hope that everybody's had a good week so far, a good Thursday. All right, if you would go to God with me and pray before we begin. Lord God, we just come to you now thanking you for the opportunity just to come together as a family of believers, just to worship and just to get a little bit more insight into your word. God, we just pray that you be with Brother Jack and all the other teachers this evening, just to remember that which they have prepared and for us just to be able to take and use which we have learned. God, we thank you for everything that you do. We thank you most of all for your Son, Jesus Christ. We pray this in his name. Amen. The song before our classes this evening will be The Steadfast Love of the Lord. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning, great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. Therefore I will hope in him. We're dismissed to class.
Okay. All right. All right, good evening. I think, this is loud enough. We're in the book of Genesis. So far, we've gone through chapters 1 to 11, which cover great events. One of the easiest ways to remember the book of Genesis is the first part, verses chapters 1 through 11 deal with great events. You have the creation, you have the fall, you have the increase of wickedness followed by the flood, and then you have the Tower of Babel. And in chapter 11, we had a genealogy from Shem all the way down to Abraham or Abram. And this is leading into the next section where we're talking about special people. And we're going to be talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph. And they're the main characters in the rest of the book. And this whole thing is really providing the foundation for the story of God's plan of salvation. The whole Bible is about that. It all centers around Jesus. And all of these other things are pointing to that. And we'll see so many different things being essentially arrows pointing to the Christ who is to come. And right now we're tracing, and we will continue to trace, the seed of woman through whom Satan's head would be crushed. And we're going to be introduced to, I started last time a little bit about the promises made to Abram. Abram Abram and his family lived in Ur of the Chaldees. According to Joshua, in Joshua chapter 2, he says, "The God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and multiplied his descendants and gave him Isaac." So according to Joshua, when they were in Ur of the Chaldees, they had been idol worshippers, but God called Abram. I will accidentally go back and forth between Abram and Abraham. Abram was Abraham's name for partway through the text we'll cover, and then his name was changed to Abraham, same person. Evidently, he and his family were idol worshippers, but having been called by God to leave and go to this other land, they decided to trust in God's promises and God's leading rather than the idols that they had been worshiping. Yes? No. No, they probably didn't. One of the things I think that Joshua was getting at was sort of to reminding them of the dangers of idolatry and how close they were to going back into it. It's sort of like, look, your forefather came out of this stuff, and you guys had trouble with this, and I'm leaving you now, so choose now who you're going to serve. This is part of that sermon that he was teaching at the very end. Choose now who you're going to serve, the God who delivered you from Egypt or these other gods. But the whole point is that God is God. And so Abram was called. They went out to the land of Haran, and that was where Terah died. Probably, we don't know exactly how that all transpired. More likely than not, maybe Terah was old at that time and maybe too feeble to continue the journey, and after he died, God called him to finish the job. We don't know. But in chapter 12, God makes a promise to Abram and calls him from the land of Haran down to Canaan. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." There are a lot of aspects to this call. One is the idea of progressing on to the goal, where God had initially called Abram to go. There was a land that he was going to inherit, that he was going to show Abram. They said, all right, now get on with it, let's go. And of course, Abraham did that because he took God at his word. And that was the kind of thing that Abram tended to do. That was the faith that he had and the faith that we could imitate. The promise, I will make you a great nation. This was a promise that God had made to Abram, and that would be repeated several times during the course of his life. And I will bless you. And God had been blessing him in Haran, and he would continue to bless him, and he would become wealthier and stronger and more numerous. But notice, he said, I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And this is sort of a side note, but something of interest for us. When God blesses us, he doesn't bless us just because he likes us. He does that, yeah. But he blesses us so that we can be a blessing to other people. It isn't meant to be a selfishly used blessing, but a blessing that is meant to be broadcast, to be used in a way that will help and enrich other people as well. And Abraham became a blessing to other people. And of course, more than he even realized, in that he was going to originate the Christ, or be an ancestor of the Christ. Notice at the very end of verse 3, in him all the families of the earth will be blessed. And again, this is pointing toward the Christ. It will get more specific as we go on, but this is an allusion to the Christ that's going to come through Abram. One other thing I want to point out before we go on, it says, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. What does he mean by that, do you think? Protection, yeah. I'm with you, and I will protect you. You have enemies, I'm at your side, and they're in trouble. Essentially, that's what he's saying. Now, this is something that sort of leads us into the next section in a way. A lot of times we think about Abraham as being some kind of Sherman tank of faith. You know, he just plows through and trusts God all of the way. But he was a lot like us. He had his strong times and his weak times. He had his frailties and he had his triumphs. And all along the way, God was giving him words of encouragement, providing him with reminders and helps, and in ways in which that would tend to help his faith grow. And we're going to see that kind of thing here. And one of the first things that happened after he gets into the promised land and is there for a little while is there's a famine. And I kind of think he forgets that little part about I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. I think at that juncture, his faith is a little bit, it's being tested, and it gets a little bit wobbly, I guess, as the British would say. Got a little bit wobbly on things. He goes down into the promised land. And it says in verse 4, Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And thus they came to the land of Canaan. And then in the next few verses, it talks about him stopping at various places and Abram worshiping God by the oak of Morah, and then later on near Bethel. He built altars and called on the name of the Lord. In verse 7, God reassured Abram. He said, to your descendants I will give this land. And Abraham built an altar to the Lord. So Abraham got in the promised land. God reassured him, hey, I'm going to give you this land. You're here. And he journeyed on and going toward the southern part of Canaan, the Negev. And then in verse 10, it says, now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came about when he came near Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, see now, I know that you're a beautiful woman, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. And they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you're my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. I'll point out a couple of things. I used to think, and I know people used to think too, that Abram and Sarai and Lot were just, two old people and their nephew wandering around all by themselves and going to this land. But from what I read, even up to this point, he had lots of goods, and he had people, he had servants, and he had people. And from what happens later, of course, it's some years later, so maybe he grew, but eventually he got to a point where he had 318 young men who were born in his household who were trained in war. So Abraham, at over a period of time, maybe starting in Haran, was sort of like a tribal leader or a potentate of some kind of wealth and extent. You know, it was like a traveling town almost. It wasn't just, Abram and his wife and Lot. And all right, here he's in the promised land, and you have Egypt down south, and you have the old Babylonian Empire up north, but in between, it was sort of a no man's land, and the two kingdoms hadn't really extended too hard or powerfully there. And so Abraham would be wandering around, and he would meet other people in the same situation as he was, that he made friends with, like Mamre and what's the other guy's name? I'm forgetting their names, but he had 3 other friends in the area. There were towns, some of them were city-states, maybe not of a size that he would be overly afraid. But now, in the famine, what was he going to do? He was going to Egypt. Now, Egypt was a kingdom. It was an empire. It ruled land, and they had armies. And, okay, God called him to this land, and he was going to be protected and all of that. But now there's a famine, and he's leaving his usual territory. And you can sort of see why he might get a little bit scared about that. And usually, a lot of times, what happens is when we get frightened and that sort of thing, sometimes we resort to maybe some techniques that we used to use before we followed God. And in this case, Abraham is saying, well, why don't we just pull a deceit here, and at least I'll live. I might lose you, but I'll save my life. And that was the arrangement that he made with Sarai. And he made that arrangement, and it came out the way he arranged it, and probably much to his chagrin. In verse 15, Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. Now what happens? He put together this scheme, and then all of a sudden that scheme was transpiring, and the results weren't too great. Well, the Lord was with him anyway. In verse 17, the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She's my sister,' so I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife, take her and go." Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. So he got his retinue together, and he said, "You're getting out of here." Notice he let Abraham keep all his stuff too. It's interesting. I mean, you compare that to the way Pharaoh behaved when Moses was asking to have the Israelites leave. Pharaoh was a lot more amenable to the Lord's urging. It just took one plague for him to figure out what was going on. Probably God spoke to him. It doesn't say how. But Pharaoh found out, and all right, God was protecting Moses, was protecting Abram, even though Abram was trying to manage it himself, but he couldn't. And isn't that the way it is with us sometimes? We try to do things our way, and we mess up, and we get sort of hung out to dry, so to speak, and the Lord comes in to pull us out. I don't know, it sounds, I don't know if you're familiar with it. Maybe those of you who are a little bit older might remember the I Love Lucy shows. There are a lot of repeats, so maybe you've seen them. It just maybe it's a little sacrilegious, but I almost see putting on a play with Lucy and Desi, Lucy and Ricky Ricardo being Abram and Sarai and Fred and Ethel being Pharaoh and Pharaoh's number one wife. Because that's what they used to do. They used to tell these lies, you see, to each other in order to manipulate and get their own way and that sort of thing. And then what happens, the lie starts to work, but it works too well, and they have to keep covering over these lies until finally they go through all of these agonizing antics because they're frantic. How do I get out of this? And then, of course, at the very end, everything comes out and it straightens out. Well, it's sort of like this. God was letting Abram and Sarai get a taste of what their lie was producing and start sweating bullets. And he sort of let them hang for a while. And then, okay, boom, he rescued them. So he was teaching them a lesson. Who really protects you? Did your lie protect you, or did I protect you? God protected them. And that's really what, that's what they should have realized in the first place, and been able just to tell the truth and rely on God to be able to take care of the rest. But that's sort of like us, though. Don't we sometimes do that? We try to fix things our own way, and it doesn't work, and God has to straighten the mess out. Mm-hmm.
We make mistakes
Mm-hmm.
several times,
Mm-hmm.
but God doesn't rule him out because he made a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't throw him aside and choose somebody else. So
Yes.
sometimes we feel when we make one mistake that God's never going to forgive us, and we won't be any good for him, so he'll never use us.
That's a very good application, because sometimes, we make a mistake and, I blew it, and how could God possibly care for me now? And it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. What happens, I don't know if you've ever if you've had kids and your child got into trouble for some reason, maybe you'll hold back and let them feel the effect of their trouble before you go in and rescue them. But you do rescue them, right? You don't just say, well, you blew it, so you're not my child anymore. You let them face some of the consequences, and then you get them out of the tree that they weren't supposed to be climbing, or whatever it happened to be. Yes. We don't know how to forgive, and we don't picture God's forgiveness. Yeah.
What we do to ourselves is what we really do to others.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like, what I see in you
Mm-hmm.
is really what's in me, right?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and he's doing that to God in a sense. Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, sometimes, I wouldn't forgive me, so God can't forgive me. When really we ought to see how God forgives and then be so grateful. And then so willing to forgive other people and copying him. And it takes some time and some learning, doesn't it? And they still don't always get it right. We don't, yeah.
Forgiveness is required. For me, it's one of the most difficult things
Mm-hmm.
to practice.
Yes.
When somebody's hurt me or somebody has messed me around,
Mm-hmm.
I keep that and I keep on going over that,
Yes.
all the things I dislike about it.
Yeah.
It's like an open wound.
Yes. Yeah. Especially.
A very nice saying, why keep an open wound when forgiveness can close it?
Very true. Very true.
That's the difficult thing to do.
It is, especially if there hasn't been any reconciliation and healing in a interpersonal level. But the best we can do is not bring it up to ourselves over and over and over again, like picking at a sore. And we could have this determination of not taking our own revenge or making the person pay for it, and answering evil with good, and hope for other changes that might produce reconciliation or better. Yeah. Lou.
It is really, really difficult, as Brother Mel said.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what kind of makes me think about and really work hard at is that I know I'm an imperfect person too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, you know, there are so many things that I've let God down so many times. And as long as I hold on to that, but not trying to work through that, then my stuff is just building up. God is not forgiving me, you know, because, you know, that's the impetus for me to work through it, to try to put it to bed, to reestablish that relationship, to try to make it right, and try not to hold on to it. And sometimes it takes a lot of prayer to do that, and realizing too that you know, that I'm imperfect.
Yes.
And there's so many times that I've sinned against God.
Yeah.
And just as others hurt me, I've hurt him. And I realize that.
Yeah. It's true. And I think we can rejoice in the fact that, you know, God stuck with Abram, even though he was failing in his trust at this point. He wasn't denying God. He was just, oh, maybe God was protecting me in the promised land, but how about now? Or maybe he protects me, he's protecting me because he gave me these extra soldiers around me, but now I'm outnumbered. You know how that goes. And sometimes that's the way it is with us. We'll have these times when we're caught off guard and we're not trusting in God, and we do it the wrong way and not trust in him. And I say, oh boy, I blew it, and we know better later. But he's with us. He rescued us from it. He cares about us even though we blew it. What happens, when your child, goes off the wrong area and you corral them back? God shepherds us. The shepherd doesn't say, well, that one wants to go off, well, forget about him. And that's what God does. And here was God's shepherding. He takes his staff and rescues Lot and Sarai. He rescues Sarai and Abram. He has plans for them. And he knows they're faithful. He knows they believe in him. And he wants them to trust in him more than they were trusting in him at that moment. And I think that's an important thing that God wanted them to know. God demonstrated, I will curse those who curse you and bless those who bless you in that moment, even though Abram precipitated the incident. God still demonstrated his care and his concern and his protection. And hopefully, well, it lasted for a while. And Abram showed courage in many areas and faith in many areas, although he did slip in this particular direction once more with a king named Abimelech in the Philistine territory. But that was a number of years later. A similar incident. And again, I'll mention it here, and I won't re-teach that passage, but in a similar incident that happens, and it sort of reminds me in a way, when I slip up in my faith, I tend to do it along the same lines, along the same ways. There's some things are easier for me to trust God to get through, and other things I'm more inclined to panic and mess up. And I think that was the kind of thing that happened to Abraham. He's like us. Yeah, Craig.
Go back to the forgiveness. It's like somebody does something to me at work or something. It's like, yeah, okay, I can forgive him, I can be thinking about it. But the more they do it, the harder it is to forgive him. But this is where he's showing that, hey, you're doing the same thing over and over, but I'm forgiving you.
Yes. Yes. Very good. Excellent. Okay, so Abram leaves. He's escorted out. Pharaoh's scared and doesn't want, Abraham to be away. And so Abram goes back to the southern area, the Negev, with his wife and all that belonged to him and Lot. And I'm going to paraphrase. Verses 1 to 13. I may read a few verses in between, but just for the sake of time, he's in the southern area, the Negev. This is where Judah was, later on. He and Lot have prospered. They became very rich, and their servants got into fights with one another because the land was too small for them. They were arguing about pasture lands and so on. And so they were being so big and numerous that Abraham and Lot said, okay, let's not fight. Let's not have our servants fight. We're relatives. And Abram said, look, you choose to go to the right and I'll go to the left. You choose to go to the left, I'll go to the right. Pick what area you want to settle in, and we're going to have to separate because we're just too big for this particular land. We're going to have to, take our flocks and our tents and go in different directions. So Lot looks around, and Abram is generous. He gives Lot the choice, however you want to do it. And so Lot looks around and he sees the valley of the Jordan and the area surrounding the part of the Red Sea, the Dead Sea. I'll get my words right. Around the Dead Sea, and it's a rich, well-watered land. It has all sorts of vegetation. It's described as like the Garden of Eden. And so, well, I'll take that area. And so he goes. There's a problem with that, and we'll find out in the ensuing chapters. But there's an indication about it in verse 13, where it says, now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. Even though Lot chose the choicest piece of land, he didn't choose the best place to move to. And he got in trouble twice because of this. Once because there was an invasion and he was captured, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. And then a second time because they were so wicked that God had to judge the whole place and turn the whole thing into a salt land. So there's a lesson here for us to be learned. The most economically advantageous choices that we make may not always be the wisest choice. The job that produces the most money may not be the best job for you. The place that offers the most economic opportunities may not be the best place for you. There are other things to look for. And your spiritual life, the spiritual welfare of your children, how is that going to be affected? What kind of neighborhood are you going into? What kind of spiritual life you would have? Actually, there's a third mistake that Lot makes also in this whole context, is when he escapes from Sodom and Gomorrah, he ends up living as a hermit off in the mountains. And then his daughters become desperate for children, and that causes a problem. You need to look for the welfare of your family, the welfare of your soul, when you're making some of these choices, and have a spiritual dimension toward your choices. And so Lot made this choice. It looked pretty good on the surface, but it would have been better if he had, just said, well, why don't I go north? or some other place. But he didn't know that now. Hindsight's better than better than foresight. And so this is what they decided. Now, during the course of this, let's see if I find the spot. Okay, right after this, verse 14, God reassured Abram. Okay, here's Abram. He just separated from Lot, and Lot chose the better portion, so to speak, the richest portion. And here God comes along and reassures Abram. Don't worry, you made the best choice. I mean, he didn't say it that way, but I think it's sort of implied, because the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward, for all the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then so can your descendants also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abraham moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. So God reassured him, you didn't get the short end of the stick here. I want you to see all that I'm giving you, and I want you to be reminded of all that I'm promising you, and you're being taken care of. Don't worry about it. And so what happens? Abraham worships God. He trusts God that that's going to happen. And then something that I spoke about before does happen. There's a war that breaks out, and Lot and his family get captured in this war. And I'll paraphrase this too. Please read it. You get the idea, but you might be able to see why I'm paraphrasing it when you read it. Back then, well, even now nations do this. It was sort of like a protection racket. A nation would go against a city or another nation and say, how would you like some protection? And the nation and the city would say, protection? Protection from whom? Well, protection from us. If you pay us tribute, we won't break your legs. We won't burn your houses down and take you slaves. And so you'll be paying for protection. But not only that, if you give us loyalty and you take our side in things and you pay us money regularly, tribute money, not only that, but we'll help keep other people from offering you protection. And so we'll make sure they don't break your legs. We're the only one who gets to break your legs, see? And this is the way things worked. And so if you were a small city, you could only bully smaller cities. And if you're a big city and a big country, you could bully a whole bunch, you see? And so here there were these 4 kings up north who had been receiving tribute from the 5 cities around which Lot was dwelling. And after about 12 years, they decided they were going to stop paying their tribute. And of course, the collection agents were coming, the armies came, and so they fought a battle with the cities that Lot was living in, and sure enough, the kings and the people were captured, Lot was captured and his stuff, and they were carried off. So, choosing the choicest part of the land didn't turn out too good for Lot. And now he was carried off. He and his family were going to be probably slaves. They didn't kill him, so probably going to be slaves. And Abram found out about it. In verse 13, a fugitive came and told Abram the Hebrew. Now he was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken captive, he led out his trained men, born in his house, 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He had 318 soldiers in his retinue. And he went with his 3 friends who probably also had trained soldiers. So they may have had close to 1,000 fighting men. And they were going to take on these kings to rescue Lot. So it wasn't exactly like, the last chapter looks like looked like Abram was being a coward, with the lie he told about his wife, but not now. He's going to engage in a life or death battle to rescue his nephew Lot. And so they divided their forces, verse 15, divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them, and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. He brought back all the goods and also brought back his relative Lot with his possessions, and also the women and the people. So he rescued everybody and brought them all back. And this is an act of faith on Abram's part. And I'm inclined to believe that he talked to God before this happened. Maybe, certainly during, but before, probably before, or maybe after, that he did this. God blessed him with victory. That was the kind of thing that God was promising him anyway, protection. But the reason I said this is because in his encounter with Melchizedek, whom we'll talk about in a minute, he said he made an oath to the Lord God Most High that he wouldn't take any of the spoil. So that, and nobody would say that he'd made Abram rich. So it's quite possible that when he spoke to God about going into battle, he said, "Look, I just want my nephew Lot, and that's all I'm going to take." Well, I don't know the timing of it, but he did make an oath to the Lord, and the Lord was involved in it. So they come back with all of the stuff. And when they come back with all of the stuff, this fellow called Melchizedek comes and greets them. And this is a special fellow. And we have 10 minutes, and I think I can probably cover Melchizedek. I won't get as far as I thought, but that's probably good. Melchizedek, verse 18. King of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now he was a priest of God Most High. He blessed him, that is, Melchizedek blessed Abram, and said, "Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." He gave him a tenth of all. Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the spoils. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give the people to me and take the goods for yourself." Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I've sworn to the Lord God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread, nor a sandal thong, or anything that is yours, for fear you would say, 'I've made Abram rich.' I will take nothing except what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. Let them take their share," his allies that helped him win the victory. There are two things about this. One is a pretty quick lesson, and the other is a more involved lesson. I think I'll go for the more involved lesson first because that's the richer one, is this Melchizedek fellow. He just springs up out of nowhere, and here he is. He's a king, and he's a high priest. He's king over the city called Salem. And Abraham acknowledges this king and high priest as superior to himself. He gives a tithe to Melchizedek. Now, the Hebrews writer makes it very clear that it's a blessing is given from the greater to the lesser, and the tithe is given from the lesser to the greater. And so in this passage, there's an acknowledgement of Abram to Melchizedek, that Melchizedek is Abram's superior. Now, you don't hear anything about him ever again until Psalm 110. And in Psalm 110, it's a messianic psalm. It's a psalm that David wrote about the Messiah, and the whole thing, and I'll just read a bit of it, well, almost the whole thing. In verse 1 of Psalm 110, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet." Now the Jews and David himself recognized he was talking about the Messiah. One of his children, grandchildren, was going to be the Messiah. That was promised to David, that one of his children was going to be a king over God's people. And he was going to be a king, and God was going to put all of his enemies at his feet. And the tricky part here is that David, in the Spirit, called this Messiah, who was going to be David's descendant, his Lord. Jesus pointed that out a couple of times, well, in a couple of passages in the Gospels. And Jesus said, wait a minute, now everybody knows that the Father is greater than the Son, but yet David talks about his descendant as his Lord. How is that possible? Well, it is, considering the nature of Jesus, who was, according to the flesh, a son of David, but according to the Spirit, the Son of God, the eternal one, the one who became flesh. And so here he's talking about the Messiah, okay? And so it's a promise about the Messiah. And then in verse 4, it says, the Lord has sworn and will not, he's addressing the Messiah in this passage. The Lord has sworn with and will not change his mind. He's speaking to the Messiah. You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings in the day of his wrath. He will judge among the nations, and so on. He's saying that the Messiah is going to be a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Now, and the Hebrews writer goes on and ties this all up and saying, this is Jesus written all over it. That you can't be, under the Old Testament law, you can't be a priest unless you're a descendant of Levi. And in fact, you have to be a descendant of Aaron. But here, God's speaking about the Messiah being a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Well, God changed the priesthood and he changed the law. That was part of the argument that the Hebrews writer was making. But he was also saying this whole thing was a prefigurement of Christ. What was Melchizedek like? His name meant King of Righteousness. He actually was king over a city called Salem, which meant peace. So he's the King of Righteousness and the King of Peace. How did he get to be King of Righteousness and King of Peace? God appointed him. He just came out of nowhere. He just, boing, there he was. God made him that. And in the psalm we read, God swore an oath that the future king, the Messiah, was going to be high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. So it was by means of an oath of God that God installed Jesus as in the same kind of kingship, order of kingship and order of priesthood that Melchizedek had. And so he's saying Melchizedek was a type of Christ that he actually uses the word picture or portrait of Christ. That's the word that the Hebrews writers use to describe Melchizedek. He was portrayed or made as a portrait of Christ, popped out of nowhere, no genealogy. It's almost like he was there eternally. Well, Melchizedek wasn't there eternally, but Jesus was. See, Melchizedek didn't hold his priesthood because of descent, a physical descent, but because of God's command and God's order. King of righteousness, King of peace. And so here is and not only that, it was proving that since Melchizedek was greater than Abraham, that means that Jesus was greater than all of the priests that were descended from Abraham. So his priesthood was greater than the Mosaic priesthood. And so Jesus was the real deal. And just this little incident God was using as a prefigurement of the Christ. And it was, 4,000 years before Jesus came. He just arranged it. He takes real people, real events, and real sayings of real people and real events, and it all works together to point a finger at the one who's coming. And so this seemingly puzzling piece right in the middle of nowhere has great significance, but you wouldn't know it until after Jesus came and say, wow, he did have this thing planned after all. And so that's one of the big things I wanted to point out with this passage. Read, if you will, read the passage and also go into Hebrews, and I believe it's chapter 7. I have it marked, but I don't have it written down. 7 will do it. Chapter 7, and you can see that when you get home. And next time, please start reading in chapter 15 and 16, and maybe into 17. Hopefully get that far for next time. Thank you very much.
Before the family prayer, we'll sing I Love You, Lord. I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship.